Hey, thanks for pressing play on this episode of The Forgotten Hockey Players of Broadway, a nostalgic look back at my favorite Rangers from the 60s, 70s, and 80s. I'm your host, Tom Browning. Thanks for listening. Thanks for tuning in to the third episode of The Forgotten Hockey Players of Broadway. I'm your host, Tom Browning. It's with great pleasure that I focus today's episode on one of the most popular New York Rangers of all time. Without a doubt, in the mid-1960s, he was my favorite New York Ranger. One of the top 2 or 3 power forwards to ever play for the Rangers, and where there is no doubt the greatest fighter, not only in New York Ranger history, but one of the top fighters in National Hockey League history, and that is number 25, Orland Kurtenbach. Orland Kurtenbach got his start with the Rangers back in the 60-61 season after a prolific career in junior hockey and in minor league hockey. He was a big, tough, rangy center iceman who could score, who could fight, but he also possessed some strong leadership qualities, as he will demonstrate later on in his career when he became captain of the Vancouver Canucks and later head coach of the Vancouver Canucks. But again, he came up for a cup of coffee with the Rangers in the 1960-61 season. In his first 10 games, he generated 6 assists, but it was GM at the time, Mus Patrick, who felt that Orland Kurtenbach had to work on his game. So he went back to Vancouver, which at the time was the Rangers' Western Hockey League affiliate in the minor leagues, to do just that. And he had a great, great season with the Vancouver club in the minor leagues. It was this performance out in Vancouver that the Boston Bruins became very familiar with Orland Kurtenbach. And when the Rangers exposed Kurtenbach to the interleague draft back in 61-62 season, it was the Boston Bruins who seized the opportunity to select Orland Kurtenbach to join their roster for the 61-62 season and the 62-63 season. It was those 2 years with the Bruins that Orland Kurtenbach really perfected his game or developed his game and became a bona fide National Hockey League centerman. He became known for his offensive skill as well as becoming one of the most feared fighters in the National Hockey League. After 2 years with the Bruins, it was Punch Imlach and the Toronto Maple Leafs who acquired Orland Kurtenbach. And it was this 1 year with the Maple Leafs where he was exposed to some of the top NHL talent in the league that he really became a player that Emile Francis wanted to bring back to the New York Rangers. And Emile Francis did just that when Toronto exposed Kurtenbach again in the interleague draft right before the 66-67 season. Emile Francis selected Kurtenbach without batting an eyelash, and it was those next 4 or 5 seasons that Orland Kurtenbach became known as one of the top power forwards in the game and really distinguished himself as one of the most intimidating fighters in the National Hockey League. And when you're a New York Ranger fan and you've got a player like Orland Kurtenbach, who not only was an intimidating player, but did everything he could to protect his teammates, that really stood out. Because let's face it, as a New York Ranger fan, power forwards, intimidating players, and New York Rangers are not synonymous. And when the Rangers had a player like Orland Kurtenbach, he instantly became a fan favorite. Very similar to when Reggie Fleming played for the New York Rangers and also was a teammate of Orland Kurtenbach during the 66-67 season. But Orland Kurtenbach was one of the most intimidating players in the league. And I remember some of the fights he had with some of the greatest fighters in National Hockey League history. As a matter of fact, the Montreal Canadiens, they had 3 players who were some of the greatest fighters that the game has ever seen. And that was Teddy Harris, Terry Harper, and John Ferguson. Now, Orland Kurtenbach had fights with Ted Harris, Terry Harper, but fans can't believe that he never had a fight with John Ferguson. And that's one of the real curiosities going back to the 60s as to why those 2 heavyweights never fought. But they never did. But I remember fights between Orland Kurtenbach and Ted Harris, Orland Kurtenbach and Terry Harper. I remember some games against the Boston Bruins where Orland Kurtenbach had some great fights with Wayne Cashman, who, as hockey fans know, and especially New York Ranger fans, was one of the top power forwards to ever play with the Boston Bruins. And again, Orland Kurtenbach was known to having the fastest fists in the National Hockey League, but so did Wayne Cashman. Wayne Cashman was a lefty, and he could throw them. And Orland Kurtenbach was a righty, and he can throw those. And I remember one game in particular. It was the 1969-70 season where the Boston Bruins were physically having their way with the New York Rangers, and that was Derek Sanderson's, I believe that was Sanderson's rookie year. And Derek Sanderson came on the scene like gangbusters as a very cocky, charismatic, aggressive, mouthy hockey player. And Eddie Jockman actually skated to the face-off circle right in front of his goal mouth and told Derek Sanderson that we were out to get you this particular game. And the game was marred by many different fights. I remember some fights between Sanderson and Arnie Brown, Dave Ballon, and Don Marcotte. There was a couple of fights with Walt Kachuk and Dallas Smith. But there was actually two fights in particular between Orland Kurtenbach and Wayne Cashman. There's actually one long fight, but they went at it twice after the referees had separated them the first time. But that wasn't the only time that those two fought. And there were fights that I remember between Orland Kurtenbach and Derek Sanderson, Kurtenbach and Cashman, as I mentioned, Orland Kurtenbach and Terry Harper and Ted Harris. That was some of the best fights you'd ever want to see in the National Hockey League. Kurtenbach was not only a great fighter, but he was a great hockey player. As a matter of fact, back in 66-67, his first season with the Rangers, Jean Rattel had major back surgery, had spinal fusion surgery, and it was Orland Kurtenbach who became the first-line center of the Rangers between Vic Hatfield and Rod Jobert. And in that season, Kurtenbach had 11 goals and 36 points. And then the following season, when he was the Rangers' third-line center, he had a career high for the Rangers with 15 goals and 38 points. So he really distinguished himself as one of the top power forwards in the game. Now, you have to come to appreciate the fact that back in the 60s, there weren't many 50-goal scorers. As a matter of fact, the top scorers in the league would score between 25 and 35 goals. So you had a physical power forward like Orland Kurtenbach, who scored 11 goals one year, 15 goals the next. He was an incredibly indispensable hockey player. He had tremendous leadership qualities. He gave the Rangers' skilled players the time and space that they needed to really show off their skills and their talents. And when Orland Kurtenbach got hurt back in the 68-69 season, as a matter of fact, he had the same surgery as Jean Rattel. He had spinal stenosis surgery. It led Emil Francis to really reduce his playing time in 69-70. But even in 69-70, he played 53 games and really demonstrated his leadership and his team play by taking on some of the greatest fighters in the National Hockey League and providing the time and space that the Rangers' skilled forwards needed to be productive on the ice. But after the 69-70 season, with Orland Kurtenbach still struggling to come back from that surgery from a season earlier, Emil Francis told Kurtenbach that he was going to expose him in the expansion draft. And it was in 69-70 that the Buffalo Sabres and the Vancouver Canucks were entering the National Hockey League to start the 70-71 season. So Emil Francis said, Orland, do you have a preference? And Orland Kurtenbach, I believe, was dating a woman at the time from Vancouver. And he said, you know what, I really would like to be selected by the Vancouver Canucks. And sure enough, Emil Francis did put Orland Kurtenbach, exposed him to the expansion draft. And it was the Vancouver Canucks who picked up Orland Kurtenbach and instantly named him captain of the team. So for the first 4 seasons, and the only 4 seasons that Kurtenbach played with Vancouver, he had some of his greatest offensive production, where he scored over 20 goals twice with the Vancouver Canucks. He actually was the captain, as I mentioned, for the first 4 seasons, and later became head coach of the Vancouver Canucks during the 1976-77 season. So Orland Kurtenbach will go down as one of the top power forwards to ever play for the New York Rangers, one of the best fighters, not only in franchise history, but in National Hockey League history. He was a leader of men. He demonstrated that leadership in the minor leagues, with the Rangers, with the Vancouver Canucks. He later became a head coach. And needless to say, he became one of the fan favorites, not only in New York, but in Boston, Toronto, and Vancouver as well. As a matter of fact, he earned the fan MVP for the Vancouver Canucks 3 out of his 4 seasons. So as we wrap up this episode of the Forgotten Hockey Players of Broadway, Ranger fans of my generation are kept wondering what would have happened if Emil Francis had kept Orland Kurtenbach on the big club during the early to mid-70s. What would have happened if he did not expose Orland Kurtenbach to the expansion draft that year? What sort of impact would Orland Kurtenbach have had during the 1971-72 Stanley Cup Finals against the Boston Bruins? Could his big, strong physical presence, his skill set, could he have neutralized the Wayne Cashmans, the Ken Hodges, the Don Marcotts, and the other tough Boston Bruin players? Could he have protected the likes of Brad Park, Jean Rattel coming off major ankle surgery that year, Rod Gilbert, Vic Hatfield, Bobby Rousseau, Pete Stemkowski, Bruce McGregor? Could he have given the Rangers skill players, the gag line, all the time and space they needed to finally beat the Boston Bruins and win their first Stanley Cup since 1940? What about a couple of years later, when the Philadelphia Flyers, the Broad Street Bullies, rose to prominence and routinely had their way physically against the New York Rangers? How about the playoffs in the mid-70s? Well, while Orland Kurtenbach was scoring 20 goals a season for the Vancouver Canucks, would he have been able to neutralize the Dave Schultzes, the Don Seleskis, the Bob Kellys, the Ed Van Imps, the Gary Dornhoffers? Could the Rangers have beaten the Flyers in the playoffs in the mid-70s? I guess we'll never know. So that wraps up episode 3 of the Forgotten Hockey Players of Broadway, focusing on my favorite New York Ranger from the mid-1960s, number 25, center iceman, Orland Kurtenbach. Thank you for listening. This has been a Go Tommy Boy production.